Richard Garriott is the president of the Explorers Club, and he's going to talk about exploration, both in a big macro sort of universal sense and also in a more focused way. He's the only person in the world to have visited space, both the North and South Pole, and the lowest physical point on the planet. He's an adventurer, a video game entrepreneur, and president of the most important exploration organization in the world. He's someone you, your children, your grandchildren would love to meet. Please welcome Richard Garriott.
Well, thank you all so very much for inviting me out here. Randy and your whole team, it's phenomenal to be out here with you today. All of you here today, too. I've had a chance to talk with some of you yesterday when I arrived, and many of you at lunch or in the halls. And of course, listening to these fine speakers is just an amazing opportunity for all of us, I think. And Sean, I don't know if you made it back to your seat yet, but you know, he was mentioning how all these other people, these other artists were sort of inspired to make that leap. And I wanted to share that, actually, ad hoc here at the beginning of mine. You know, my father was also an astronaut. My father was a NASA astronaut. My neighbors were astronauts. Joe Engle was an astronaut on my right. Hoot Gibson, an astronaut, lived to my left. All the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo people lived next door or nearby. And and even you know, in my neighborhood or at my home, we always had the best techno toys you could possibly imagine, you know, as my childhood playthings as I was growing up. But then at the age of 13, the NASA doctor, who was our family doctor, was giving me an eye test, determined that I was going to need glasses, and very flippantly told me, "Oh, Richard, I hate to break it to you, but because you need glasses, you are no longer eligible to be an astronaut." And at that moment, I was horrified, because I was still too young to have ever decided if I wanted to be an astronaut. I just assumed we were all going to go to space one day, because every adult I knew was involved in going to space. And here I was being kicked out before I even had the chance to think about it. And after a few days of fretting about it, I finally concluded, who are you, doctor, to be the gatekeeper of space? If I can't go by the NASA rules, I'm going to make my own space agency. And that's what I did. And so I'll tell you part of that in this story here. You know, as I think about exploration, exploration has always been a defining aspect of the human experience. And we explored for a variety of reasons, whether it was to chase down the prey that was running away from us, whether it was to solve various problems of finding better comfort or tool or opportunities. We always spread out as soon as we existed. And while it took 4 billion years for humans to evolve on this planet, it only took 300,000 years for us to cover the entire planet, except Antarctica. But that first 300,000 years took us up to about 200 years ago. And 200 years ago, we arrived at the first 1 billion people after 300,000 years. And in the last 200 years, due to a lot of the health improvements you saw in some earlier slides from other people, we've now shot from 1 billion people to almost 8 billion people and growing here on the surface of the planet. And I'm sure you would understand that is going to that's an enormous impact that it is now putting on the planet. And in 2008, when I had the opportunity to fly on the International Space Station for a few weeks, it was very obvious looking down at the Earth, just subjectively. But then you come back down to the ground and you look up the data, and objectively it tells you the same, that humanity is now using resources at about 1.5 times the Earth's ability to produce those resources. And so that means we absolutely have a substantial impasse ahead of us. And that impasse means we have really one of two choices. One is that we're going to have to deal with massive resource rationing and scarcity, or we're going to have to spend a lot more time and effort in exploration to both understand what resources we can still use or find new resources, find out how our large-scale systems work of life on this planet, to know what we should protect and, frankly, how we should protect it. And that brings us back over to people who go out as explorers, of which I like to count myself now, too. And what's interesting is this organization that I'm currently president of, it was actually started 118 years ago in 1904 in what I like to describe as the heroic age of exploration. And I've put some pictures down here of some of our very first few presidents. The portrait in the middle, which used to hang in the United States Capitol, is from the Greely expedition, where they went up to the North Pole to see or towards the North Pole to see how far north they could get. Ended up getting stranded for 3 years. 26 men went in, only 6 survived, and had to cannibalize a lot of the others that had died along the way. And that's the person who became the first president of the Explorers Club. The guy you see there with the leopard, he was a guy named Carl Akeley. He was the person who made all the taxidermy that hangs in the Museum of Natural History in New York. And he was attacked by that leopard, which was eating him alive. And in a last desperate move, he shoved his arm down its throat, made a fist, and twisted, and managed to suffocate the leopard before he had his arm chewed off. As you can see, his arm in the sling. And another early president, Freuchen there on the right, mountain of a man wearing his polar bear coat. His wife was one of the leaders of Vogue magazine there, sitting on his left. And he got also trapped in the Arctic. His leg froze on one expedition. It began to gangrene, and he was a surgeon, so he cut it off. And so you can't see his peg leg there on his peg leg left leg. And so that's that heroic age. So fortunately, we've come a long way since. But the Explorers Club, along the way, we kind of keep a list of what we think of as the famous first, the things, the biggest adventures, the biggest successes they've had. And in 1909, Perry Hinson and 4 Inuits, Uta, Ukwe, Siglu, and Eningwa, those last 4 we're going to be celebrating actually at the club next month. They made it to the North Pole. In 1911, the South Pole was reached by a Norwegian team. A British team was hot on their heels, got there second, and all died on the way out. 1953, Tenzing Norgay and Edmund Hillary made it to the top of Everest. In 1960, Don Walsh, who's a good friend of mine at the Explorers Club, and Jacques Picard became the first people to get down to the bottom of the Mariana Trench, a place I visited a year ago this week. And the bottom of the Mariana Trench, by the way, has only been visited one other time in history prior to the vehicle I'll talk about in a minute. And in 1969, you're all aware, we saw some footage of people making it to the moon with Neil and Buzz. And interestingly, the last in-person big event we did at the Explorers Club was to celebrate, the surviving at the time Apollo astronauts. 2 of these gentlemen have actually since then passed. But in the Explorers Club, we had that's a membership card of Wernher von Braun down there at the bottom, and the application of President Teddy Roosevelt, who was a member of the Explorers Club too. But the picture on the bottom right is my daughter, because my daughter got up on stage and asked these gentlemen at the end of the time I had on stage to be asking them questions about space travel. And she asked, "Why are there no women up there?" And it was Rusty Schweigert who had the best answer. He actually said, he knows Kinga, and he said, "Kinga, it's because we are a lot smarter now than we were back then." And that is true now across the Explorers Club and all fields of I think, science and exploration. For 40 years now, we've been really advancing and celebrating women explorers. You might recognize Dr. Sylvia Earle in the upper left, or Kathy Sullivan, another fellow astronaut who went down also to the Mariana Trench. She actually went down before me, so she's the first person to go space to deep, and I became the second person, first man, to go space to deep. But I had to put on my pins for North Pole and South Pole because she hasn't done both of those yet, so I still have her on one. But this is an important initiative we have these days too, which is we noticed that if you look at the history of exploration, it still is dominated by European ancestry, older, tending to be male individuals. And we, even 40 years ago, we began to really purposely try to make sure we celebrated not only everybody that was on these expeditions, because it was usually only one European with a lot of other people from other parts of the world, but we now cast a much wider net. And so last year we did the first, and right now we're doing the second. We're getting ready to publish it. What we call is the Explorers Club 50, 50 people changing the world that the world needs to know about. And by casting a global net, by really looking for who are the people all around the globe that are making a difference, just by casting a global eye, you end up picking people of all different parts of the world by plan, but you get different races, different ethnicities, different genders, of course, different religions, and all kinds of other circumstances. And when we published about a year ago this first Explorers Club 50, if you look at the picture on the upper picture on the right, the woman in the middle is Dr. Cyan Proctor, who we first celebrated as a member of the Explorers Club 50, but then she was selected to be part of the inspiration for the first fully private space mission on SpaceX recently last summer. What I find most interesting is that, in contrast to that heroic age of exploration where people risked and often lost life and limb, I now really do believe that we're in a new golden age of exploration. And that golden age is brought into being by a lot of things you've already been hearing about today, which is these exponential technologies that we're in. That we're now at a time where not only is health being impacted, not only is obviously computing power, not only is military offense and defense being deeply impacted, but so is exploration. We're now opening new frontiers that we didn't have access to before, but also being able to re-example old frontiers in ways that we never could even just 10 years ago, all because of this exponential technology. And I think it was mentioned in my introduction, but I haven't really talked about it, that my first career, the thing that actually funded all of my exploration, is I'm actually a video game developer. So right about the same time the doctor was telling me that I couldn't go to space, I also discovered computers. And I became one of the first people ever to develop computer games. And the word, even though you guys are at least old enough, most of the audiences I talk to aren't old enough to have played them, but I wrote a series of games called Ultima that unless you were hardcore gamers, you wouldn't know. But the word avatar, which is obviously pretty ubiquitous now, comes from my games. The category of games referred to as massively multiplayer, which is now the most popular category, comes from my games. And that allowed me to join organizations like the Explorers Club, and I actually got to help build companies by using this exponential technology. I actually helped found companies and organizations to open up the poles and the deep sea and space to exploration. And and I think all of you have seen things like Elon Musk's SpaceX rockets able to land themselves, which seems pretty darn miraculous, except that it's really basically a Segway. It's a rocket with the same kind of balancing technology inside of it as you think of as a Segway. Simple thing your kids buy now as a toy. Or more specifically, even Virgin Galactic, which was based out of something called the X Prize that a group of us put together. Or Blue Origin, which is now, of course, taking quite a few people to space in this last year. But I would argue that since space is sort of my primary interest of exploration, I would argue that the commercial space race really began about in 1998, and that's when we kicked off this thing called the X Prize. We put up a $10 million prize for the first private vehicle to fly twice into space. We backed that up with a company called Zero G Corp that does parabolic flights to give you a taste of zero gravity, so that people could see what space was like or feel what it was like. And we started a company called Space Adventures to book seats on what we thought would be purely suborbital vehicles to prove there was a market, so that if you could win the prize, if you bothered to spend money to win the prize, you could be confident you could actually ultimately make money at it with the vehicle that you brought into existence. And the vehicle that won the X Prize now hangs in the Smithsonian right next to the Wright brothers plane. But if you think about what was blocking space travel, and I mentioned my father being an astronaut. He flew twice, once on the space shuttle, and before that he flew on Skylab. But back in his day, and especially on the space shuttle, space access was expensive and dangerous, really dangerous. And by the way, it was a few $100 million per passenger to just in hard costs, and mathematically predicted and in fact happened a 1 out of 70 catastrophic failure ending in death. So if something is that expensive and that risky, it makes sense that it would be pretty darn uncommon. But if you look around at other forms of transportation, that's not been true. So if you're looking at planes or cars or boats or trains, all of them have had the economics of only costing about 3 times as much as you put in it in energy to operate it. And that 3 times multiplier is just to pay for depreciation and maintenance of the vehicle. But space vehicles were more than 100 times the cost of the fuel that went into the pay, and that's mostly because you were throwing away the rocket and building a new one. So if you imagine buying a new car at the car lot, filling it up with your first tank of gas, at the end of that drive, you crush the car and buy a new car. You wouldn't drive very often. It would only be used for the really most incredibly valuable things you can imagine. But that's really what's changing so rapidly. And not only have you seen Elon landing rockets, but down there in Boca Chica, Texas, he's building this new vehicle that I literally was down there visiting. I was down here 10 days ago, crawling all around their manufacturing and launch facilities. And I was already a believer. I'm also, by the way, tipping that I'm an investor too, so I have a bias. But I actually believe, they have a good chance of making it pretty close to the numbers they've claimed, where Elon has gone out and said things like, he thinks he can get it down to about $500,000 to take somebody all the way to Mars, where today it still costs about $50 million just to go to orbit. And that's because this vehicle is completely reusable. I mean, there is nothing about this thing that is not reusable. It is even mechanically, it doesn't even use explosive bolts to get off the pad. It has, mechanical releases. There's no explosive bolts separating stages. You can just restack it and relight it. I mean, they're really focused on no waste in the reuse of the vehicle to get down to that 3 times multiple that everything else has. And of course, once you get down that low, you can also do point-to-point anywhere on Earth. So, in 45 minutes, that's the time in orbit it takes to go to the opposite side of the Earth. That's point-to-point anywhere on Earth in 45 minutes that he thinks he can get down to somewhere in the range of $1,000 a seat. And that's just truly a game changer. And what's important about this, right now, a lot of people see the commercial space race and all these, billionaire yahoos flying themselves into space, and they begrudge that, how is this helping humans on Earth, or how is this going to allow me to go? And I think they're missing the big picture, which is you have to go through this. We're coming from a time it was hundreds of millions and 1 out of 70 chance of death, and we're down to the point where some wealthy people could afford it. So good thing they're willing to spend their money and risk their lives to keep pushing it down even lower. But we're getting close to this inflection point where, I actually did a lot of commercial work on my own flight, but I spent a few tens of millions and I earned back a few ones of millions. So it was still a loss, but in this rate, within a year or two, I would have made a profit. And as soon as I can make a profit with my own time and space, I'm going every chance I get. And I predict a lot of you will too. And there's a lot of young people who will choose to do that too. And so we're really headed that way. The same thing's happening with the extreme depths. The Trieste, I mentioned my friend Don Walsh, who went down there in 1960, the year before I was born. And that vehicle could only go once. And now it hangs in a museum. Then James Cameron went in 2012. So it was almost 50 years till somebody went a second time. James Cameron went in a one-person submarine that could only survive the journey once. And that brought us up to the vehicle that I used. My friend Victor Vescovo spent his own money to build this machine. And it's the first vehicle that can now make repeated full ocean depth dives and is now opening up the 80% of the world's oceans, which before this machine were completely unvisited. And now finally, he's actually already taken this down 100 times to depths, on the order of, 10,000 meters or so. And as I mentioned, he took down Kathy Sullivan, and then later, more recently, about a year ago, he took me down. And by the way, for that, he's one of our recent, what we call Explorers Club medalists. That's our highest award for exploration, was given to Victor Vescovo. And what's amazing too is what all these satellites are bringing back for explorers. For example, just in this last couple of years, we've begun to find lost fortress cities that are out buried in the Sahara. And people, if you go explore the Sahara by a car, you're going to see a lot of sand and probably not much else. But when you're observing it from space and watching the sand dunes move, and therefore you periodically see the rock that's underneath those sand dunes, or use various wavelengths of light to do spectral analysis, you can see things through a thin sheet of vegetation or sand to begin to see things like all these ancient ruins that when once the Sahara was not a desert, we can then go back out at the right time when the dunes are away, when they've moved on, and go back and do archaeological work in these sites. And the same thing is true for finding lost cities down in the rainforests of Central and South America. That I have a bunch of our explorer friends are literally every year going out and finding completely undiscovered cities, largely with satellite telemetry. Even places that are well known, like this ancient Mayan city of Tikal, now that we have, again, better satellite radar technologies and other forms of wavelengths of light that we use, we're seeing that these cities were far larger than even modern archaeologists had known that we're finding out through satellite imagery. And then we go back to the biological world. I know you've heard a lot of people talking about that here today. We now have these portable DNA sequencers that are allowing us to really canvas the microscopic world in ways that we hadn't known before. And now, literally, instead of taking one sample a month at a faraway place, we can take these with us and sample the entire surface of the Earth at a much more finite level. And the last one I'll talk to you here, because I just now noticed I'm running out of time here, I'm slightly over on my time, is de-extinction. I happen to be an investor in a company called Colossal. It has been sending people out into the field to bring back woolly mammoth flesh to the Harvard lab of George Church. He's now been backed with a large sum of money and spun that out privately. And they have already not only acquired the flesh of woolly mammoths, they've already done the full gene sequence. They've got the gene sequence of the Indian elephant, its closest living relative. They know the 60 key genes that they need to switch. The software solution of how to use CRISPR to re-edit those genes back to effectively being a woolly mammoth are now in progress. And as soon as they believe they have that genome completely reconstructed, they plan to insert it into an Asian elephant egg and will give birth, hopefully, in the next couple of years to something that looks a lot like and acts a lot like the woolly mammoth. And so, I'm a big believer that that is at least one of the first contenders for the first great headline of the new millennium. And it's these exponential technologies that are going to solve things like, the carbon in our atmosphere. We have private space stations that are going to take over if the Russians choose to dump their part of the International Space Station. Asteroid mining, that I'm going to skip through here again for time, just because we now have, these exponential technologies that are opening up access to the bounty that sits there in the heavens. And it's really this bounty in space that is really going to help humanity because of this crush we have on the resources here on Earth. And of course, finally, I of course plan that we're going to be a multi-planet species, believe that we're going to become a multi-planet species, and I myself plan to live on Mars within my own lifetime, and I just hope I can get my kids and my wife to join me. So thank you all very much, and look forward to talking to you later.